Up next is Millie. Hey, Millie. And Millie is going to be talking about Glasgow and talking about the asylum solution in Glasgow, looking at sanitary reform and regulation of non-conforming bodies. So over to you, Millie, if you want to share your screen.
So yeah, my research takes a bit of a dark turn. So the aim of my research was to examine the relationship between 19th century Glasgow and the emergence of the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum between 1800 and 1850. Specifically, it was to understand if the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum was constructed as a form of sanitary policing to deal with dirty bodies, such as the mentally ill, or whether it was a caring response to mental illness. So initially, let's reflect on what 19th century Glasgow was like. So 19th century Glasgow was a period of destitution for many, as the city was transformed from a merchant town into a bustling industrial city, with increasing immigration, insecure employment, and inadequate infrastructure creating public health concerns. As Glasgow's population grew rapidly, urban environments brought together the wealthy and disadvantaged into closer proximity than ever before. This led to public health policies, which created the belief that the treatment of madness should take place within specialized asylum institutions. But was this due to fear of their contagion, or was it a compassionate response? And it should be noted here that individuals who suffered complex mental health conditions will be frequently referenced as non-conforming bodies, as it encompasses individuals' behaviors which were not seen as normal and also incorporates many mental health conditions which at the time were not understood in depth. So my research used a qualitative research approach, specifically the analysis of archival documentary sources from the online Wellcome Collection and the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. And these documentary sources include materials such as reports, letters, diaries, and images. To analyze these sources, I carried out qualitative coding, and that's not anything to do with computers. Qualitative coding is effectively the process of labeling and organizing archival data by breaking down vast, dense material into more meaningful and manageable chunks by setting out themes in the research you're looking for, and these are called codes. For example, on the left of the screen, I have the codes I believed would help me effectively meet my aim, and these were, for example, Glasgow's squalid streets. I then used this code as a framework to sift the archival data and select bits which matched my theme, what Glasgow's was really like. These extracts were then all placed together in a Word document and further grouped together to start to answer my overarching question, why the asylum was constructed. By doing this, I was able to build up evidence from different sources written by different individuals which echoed similar stories about the reason for the construction of the asylum. Now, it should be noted that this archival research is my attempt to understand the relationship between the city and the asylum from fragmented communications located in the Glasgow archives, which constitute the only comprehensive information resource available. First, to understand the creation of the asylum, you must understand some complex theoretical concepts. Psychoanalytical theory, to understand how Glasgow segregated individuals with mental illness, and Foucault's theoretical writings on power, which view the creation of the asylum as a form of social control. Firstly, psychoanalytical theory. Have you ever been on a train home late at night and a drunk person comes up and pesters you and sits right next to you? You're sat alone and your immediate reaction most likely would be to get up, to move to a different carriage where you're around more people and in the safety of company. Well, in essence, this is what psychoanalytical theory is. It permits techniques of separation with a desire for those who feel threatened to distance themselves from defiled people and defiled places. Now, in the 19th century, this wasn't the drunk individual on the train, but it was mentally ill people. Secondly, to understand the rationale for the creation of the asylum, Foucault, a French philosopher's contributions, suggests medicine was developed to identify problem populations who threaten society. Foucault claimed that asylums were constructed for the surveillance of non-conforming populations, and this was done mainly through the specific layout of institutions, which followed the panopticon model. The panopticon model enabled guards to continually watch multiple patients, whereas patients could only see one guard, enabling surveillance and promoting self-reflection. This is important for thinking why the asylum was constructed. Did the construction of the Glasgow Asylum reflect Foucault's theories that the asylum was created to control those with mental illness? And did it follow a panopticon layout? Now let's tell the story of the creation of the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum. The 19th century city and living conditions need to be framed as a backdrop to understand how sanitary conditions contributed to the construction of the asylum. The following archival material sets the scene. Firstly, looking at Annan's work, which is the earliest series of photos from urban slums, the image on the left of High Street captures Glasgow's dull, dirty, and poorly ventilated labyrinth of streets, and reflects the sense of loneliness and separation within slum environments. Now, written archival accounts are also valuable. Charles R. Baird, a Scottish engineer, in his report on the sanitary conditions of the working classes, writes, "I found Mrs. X and another two females occupying a small confined house, and the scene almost baffles description. They were all actually in a state of nudity, not having clothes sufficient to cover their nakedness. The house was completely destitute of beds or other furniture, positively nothing. The inmates were starving, having no food whatever in the house, and it appears they had shut themselves up for the purpose of dying, their modesty having prevented them from making their circumstances known." While the image on the right of the slide is not the woman in Baird's description, the image gives a powerful account of the dreadful living conditions he describes. And it was these profoundly deprived people that created an urban body that was a source of fear to authorities and required interventions. Initially looking at the table on this slide, it's from the Sanitary Health Committee Minute Book and details the total numbers of houses inspected, overcrowded and empty between October 1866 and January 1867. While this would appear to be a slightly random piece of archival material and unhelpful due to the later time period, it's hugely helpful for understanding the drive to clean Victorian Glasgow and single out mentally ill bodies. The table suggests there was a reduction of overcrowding, which is likely to have had a positive impact on Glasgow's health. In the above period, there was a 7% reduction in overcrowding and a 12% increase in houses not found overcrowded. Now, this illustrates the scale of police activities shifted from the public sphere to private dwellings. The police commission, instead of being guardians of public space, such as street lightings and pavements, now governed inside houses, carrying out routine inspections. Through standards of appropriate cleanliness, this revealed individuals who could not meet the required standards and acceptable behaviours. And as a result, this increased attention on how society deals with mentally ill individuals and those who could not conform. Stark, who designed the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum, discussed the detrimental impact mentally ill individuals had on Glasgow, writing, "No advantage could possibly accrue to a patient from him being made to associate with those in a more degraded state of disease, among whom some will have found whole habituaries resemble those of brutes rather than human beings." Now, linking back to psychoanalytical theory we discussed, from archival evidence we can see how in the process of urban improvement, individuals who were inflicted with mental health conditions suffered a detachment from society. Authorities shifted their attention into homes and identified the need for separate interventions to deal with physical and mental disease. For the mentally ill, this was the removal to the asylum. Now, we've understood how there was growing support for the asylum. Now, looking into the asylum itself and the practices within, we can understand the true rationale for the construction, asking ourselves, was it constructed out of compassion or an extension of sanitary policing? Bear in mind Foucault's ideas about how medicine was used to control individuals. While there were initial intentions of care, the archive reveals instances of various methods of punishment which were used to treat mental illness and can help us understand the reason for the asylum. One of the most controversial methods on the screen was the whirling chair, with individuals spun until they either submitted or were violently sick. There was the belief among doctors that the mentally ill could overcome their disruptive episodes through suffering, illustrating the disregard for care, instead subjecting individuals to torture. The most significant factor in the management of lunacy was the physical construction of the asylum. By initially looking at the architectural layout by Stark, the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum is almost a replica of Bentham's Panopticon, discussed earlier in relation to Foucault's ideas. Stark discusses how the asylum was primarily created as a space for confining individuals. He writes, "They have no view from their bedrooms. Their windows, which are placed high above their heads, the walls which surround the asylum will be of sufficient height not only to prevent patients from being seen by persons from within, but also to exclude all possibility of escape." Now, the lived realities illustrate that the asylum was not created for care, but for the security of urban environments through the segregation and punishment of populations who could not conform. So let's reflect on the archival findings I have just laid out. Firstly, my research suggests the poor were troubled with widespread overcrowding, disease, and poverty, which cascaded generations. These populations remapped a new urban body, which is a source of fear and required intervention. While the streets and dwellings could be purified, the mentally ill individual often could not, and was removed and isolated to the asylum. The story I have told, therefore, is that the construction of the asylum was a continuation of sanitary strategies for urban improvement, which locked up and often tortured mentally ill individuals as a means for improving Glasgow, rather than a compassionate community response, which looked to care for those with complex mental health conditions. I hope my research has made you think deeper about the beginnings of mental health provisions in Glasgow and reflect on how horrific these were. My research, whilst it is an attempt to tell the story, it is also an attempt to piece together and tell the story on behalf of those who were removed to the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum. However, they remain silent in history. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Millie. And again, I'm biased to this, as you know, because I'm a historian. I love this topic; it's so interesting. But there are some questions here. But before that, can I take Chair's prerogative and ask how or why did you get interested in this? What spurred your interest in this topic?
Yeah, so it is a bit of a dark and weird topic, and a lot of people wonder that, like, why would you ever want to know about this? But I had like a natural interest in history throughout uni, and I did it in first and second year. And I'm also really interested in mental health and mental health geographies. And there was something that put those two together that you feel like really sorry for those individuals that were put in those institutions, and you learn about them in history, and then you learn about modern day mental health provisions, and you kind of can't quite believe that we've come this far and that there's been so many changes, but still there is still lock wards in America, and there's still people that are locked up and punished for having mental illness. So I think what also was really interesting was that it was Glasgow as well, and it wasn't that long ago, to be perfectly honest, that was what kind of was the big fascination for me. It was a bit of a dark history, but I thought it was just fascinating.
Yeah, great, thanks. And that thing of saying it wasn't really that long ago, it really wasn't.
Yeah.
Yep. Great. Okay, so we've got a fair few questions in the Q&A. So the first one was, how was mental illness dealt with in the middle and the upper class patients? Is there a stark contrast with what you see here? Yeah,
definitely. So I'm not sure if you picked up on the slides, but when you're looking at the floor plan of the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum, where I focused it being on kind of like lock wards and that kind of idea, there was a segregation by gender and by class. And when you're reading the archives, there was also differences between what patients were fed, when they could have breaks, when they were allowed outside time and stuff like that. So it was, to be honest, quite a lot of the asylums were for people in upper classes, and it would be like their families would quite often send them away for kind of committing crimes of like cheating on husbands and stuff like that. It was like, oh well, they're mentally ill, and they were sent away. And you do find quite a lot of mentally ill individuals were kept in workhouses and things like that, and weren't picked up and weren't recognized and did live on the streets. But for those that were institutionalized, there did remain a class divide between upper and lower.
And that you kind of touched on this, but that kind of leads into another question of, were women more likely to end up in these places? Is there a gender difference in not just in maybe where they are, but in how they're treated?
Yeah. To be honest, when I was looking into this was just kind of like general curiosity when I was reading the archives, because you get so much tabulated data in them, because they have annual reports every year that they put out. And one thing that actually was quite surprising was that the gender split was pretty even. Certainly for the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum, I'm not sure if it was different throughout the country, but there was, I can't remember the exact figures, but it was like 40-50 sort of thing. It wasn't a massive divide.
Interesting. My assumption would have been that there would have been far more women there.
Yeah,
Cool.
definitely.
And then where were we? So did this? You kind of touched on this a little bit, but did this kind of approach happen across the UK or across Scotland, or was Glasgow worse, better, different?
Yeah. Well, I think Scotland was a bit unique in its approach. They had public asylums a lot sooner than England. They had private asylums. The transition from private to public happened a lot earlier in Scotland. And there was the requirement upon like local authorities, it would be now, and well, it was traditionally churches in the past, but it was local authorities now to open these institutions. And the question was across the UK, was that was the thing? Yeah. And these were spread throughout the UK. And there was a big like debate about whether these were like rural or urban kind of like institutions. But when you look at the map, they were spread throughout the country in like rural locations, central locations. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Was there a reason for why Scotland opted for? This isn't a question here. It's just out of my own interest now. Is there a reason why Scotland opted for the public asylums earlier?
There was, and I did learn about it, but I can't remember. No, there definitely was a reason. I can't remember. That's something to Google.
Yeah, fair. I'll have a look into it. Thanks. And then I think we kind of touched on this, but were there floor plans implemented? You spoke about other Scottish cities, but so where was these plans implemented? And then if we can tie that into that final question, then at what point did that stop or change?
Yeah. So in the initial construction of the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum, it was designed by Stark, who basically used Bentham's Panopticon as an architectural layout. He looked at it and it's quite obvious from the two diagrams you have side by side that they start from a radiate tower and then they spread out. And these this like architectural construction was used in a lot of asylums. It wasn't just the Glasgow one, and it continues to be used in a lot of like institutional buildings and hospitals and libraries and things like that. That layout of you have like the person who holds the power in the middle that can watch everything that's going on. I know if you look at the reading room in Glasgow University, that's a very similar layout that I sat one day and was writing about it and I was like, this is a bit weird, but yeah, it's a very similar layout. And yeah, it was deliberately implemented and it didn't get changed until the asylum got demolished on Parliamentary Road and it moved out to what is now Gartnavel, which remains a mental health institute in the kind of out past Great Western Road. And they opted to kind of step away from the carceral institution kind of construction, and they moved to more of a family orientated like house. So it was very much like you were stepping into a familiar home when you came in, and there was armchairs and there was a fire and there was a big dining hall and stuff like that. So in the initial years, it was very much it was meant to have been kind of situated around Bentham's Panopticon, but in the latter years, there was definitely a shift to change that.
Cool, great, thank you, very interesting. And very appropriate mention of the reading room, seeing as that is where we're based. Our offices are upstairs in the reading room, so we often talk about it being like Bentham's Panopticon as well. Great. Thank you so much, Millie. I think that's all of our questions. So again, really, really good job. Thank you very much.